Welcome to Bedtime Express, your nightly destination for peaceful sleep and enchanting stories. I'm your narrator, and our journey is about to start in a minute. Tonight, we're embarking on a magical journey through ancient Greece, where gods walked among mortals and heroes shaped the very fabric of legend. Over the next 3 hours, you'll drift alongside 5 of mythology's greatest champions. We'll follow Heracles through his impossible labors, witness Achilles' perfect glory on the plains of Troy, sail with clever Odysseus across wine-dark seas, walk with Theseus as he builds the foundations of democracy, and soar with Perseus on wings of divine favor. Each tale is woven with gentle pacing and soothing narration, designed specifically for adult listeners seeking rest and relaxation. If you enjoy mythological bedtime stories, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about your favorite hero, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more peaceful adventures. Your support helps us create more calming content for sleepy souls everywhere. Now, find your most comfortable position, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow your mind to release the worries of the day. Close your eyes, relax your shoulders, and prepare to be gently carried into the timeless realm of heroes and legends. Sweet dreams await you on the Bedtime Express. 5 greatest heroes of Greek mythology. In the gentle twilight of our imagination, we begin with the mightiest of all heroes, Heracles, whose very name means glory of Hera, though the goddess herself would become his greatest tormentor. Picture, if you will, the city of Thebes, bathed in golden sunset light, where a child was born who would bridge the world of mortals and immortals. His father was Zeus, king of the gods, whose love for the mortal princess Alcmene would set in motion a destiny both glorious and tragic. From his divine heritage came strength beyond measure, but from his human mother came something equally precious: compassion, the ability to suffer, and the capacity for growth through adversity. Even as an infant in his cradle, Heracles displayed the power that would define his legend. When Hera, jealous of Zeus's infidelity, sent 2 serpents to destroy the baby, the child's hands closed around their necks with such force that they perished instantly. His mortal parents found him the next morning, playing contentedly with the lifeless coils, his first victory already won in innocence. As Heracles grew from child to youth, his education encompassed both the arts of civilization and the skills of warfare. The centaur Chiron, wisest of his kind, taught him the healing arts and the secrets of nature. From Eurytus, he learned the bow, becoming so skilled that his arrows never missed their mark. Linus instructed him in music and letters, though the young hero's strength sometimes proved troublesome when he gripped his lyre too tightly. But it was in the wild places, among the hills and forests surrounding Thebes, that Heracles truly found himself. He would spend long hours in solitude, learning to understand the language of wind through leaves, the patterns of animal tracks in soft earth, the way morning mist revealed the hidden paths through valleys. These quiet moments of connection with the natural world would sustain him through the trials to come. When Heracles reached manhood, his first great deed came in defense of his homeland. The city of Thebes had fallen under the tribute demands of the minions of Orchomenus, a burden that impoverished and humiliated the proud Thebans. Young Heracles, seeing the suffering of his people, resolved to end this injustice. With a small band of volunteers, he ambushed the tribute collectors, sending them back to their king with a message written in their wounds. When King Erginus responded with his full army, Heracles led the Thebans in a battle that would be remembered for generations. His strength turned the tide, but it was his strategic mind and inspirational leadership that truly won the day. The victory brought him the hand of Megara, daughter of the Theban king, and for a time, domestic happiness blessed the hero's life. 3 children came from their union, and Heracles knew the quiet joys of fatherhood, teaching his sons to draw a bow, watching them play in the palace gardens, holding them as they drifted off to sleep. But Hera's jealousy never slept, and she watched the hero's happiness with growing resentment. Using her divine power, she sent madness upon Heracles, a madness so complete that in his delirium he could not distinguish friend from foe, love from hatred, reality from nightmare. In his madness, Heracles committed the unthinkable. He killed his wife and children, believing them to be enemies sent to destroy him. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, his anguish shook the very foundations of Thebes. The hero who had seemed invincible discovered that his greatest enemy was not any monster or tyrant, but the darkness that could exist within his own mind. Seeking purification and redemption, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia delivered a pronouncement that would define the rest of his life. He must serve his cousin Eurystheus, the cowardly king of Tyrans, for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king might devise. Only through this service could he atone for his crimes and find peace for his tormented soul. And so began the most famous series of heroic deeds in all mythology, tasks designed not just to test Heracles' strength, but to explore every facet of heroism itself. The first labor took him to Nemea, where a lion with hide impervious to weapons terrorized the countryside. For days, Heracles tracked the beast through rocky hills and shadowed valleys, learning its habits, understanding its nature. When he finally faced the lion in its cave, he realized that conventional weapons were useless. Instead, he used his bare hands, wrestling the creature in the darkness, until his grip around its throat finally stilled the mighty heart. From that day forward, he wore the lion's hide as armor, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come through direct confrontation with our fears. The second labor brought him face to face with the Hydra of Lerna, a serpentine monster whose heads multiplied when severed. Here Heracles learned that some problems cannot be solved by strength alone, but require strategy and the help of trusted friends. With his nephew Iolaus holding burning brands to cauterize the wounds, Heracles systematically destroyed the creature, teaching us that even the mightiest hero sometimes needs support to overcome the challenges that seem to grow stronger with each attempt to defeat them. As the labors continued, they demanded more than mere strength. Capturing the golden-horned Charanean hind required patience and persistence, as Heracles spent an entire year in gentle pursuit, never harming the sacred creature but gradually earning its trust. This labor taught him that true strength sometimes means restraint, that the greatest victories can come through understanding rather than domination. The Erymanthian boar tested his ability to think strategically, driving the creature into deep snow where its massive weight became a disadvantage. The cleaning of the Augean stables in a single day required him to redirect entire rivers, showing that intelligence and creativity could accomplish what brute force never could. With each labor, Heracles grew not just in reputation, but in wisdom. He learned to read the language of birds. From the Stymphalian birds he dispersed with bronze rattles. He mastered the art of taming wild things when he captured the Cretan bull. He understood the value of persistence when he rounded up the man-eating mares of Diomedes, transforming their savage nature through patient, consistent care. The later labors took Heracles to the very edges of the known world, each journey a pilgrimage that expanded both his geographical and spiritual horizons. When he retrieved the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, he discovered that even the fiercest warriors could be moved by respect and honest communication. Their initial meeting was one of mutual recognition, two souls who understood the burden of extraordinary strength and the loneliness it could bring. The cattle of Geryon led him across North Africa and through Spain, a journey that took months and brought him into contact with cultures and peoples whose customs and wisdom enriched his understanding of the world. He established the Pillars of Heracles at the Strait of Gibraltar, marking the western boundary of the Mediterranean world, but also symbolizing his own journey to the limits of what was possible for a mortal hero. The golden apples of the Hesperides required him to convince the Titan Atlas to help him, leading to one of the most psychologically complex of all the labors. For a time, Heracles literally carried the weight of the world on his shoulders while Atlas retrieved the apples. In that moment of cosmic responsibility, the hero understood something profound about the nature of duty and the price of bearing others' burdens. When Atlas tried to abandon his eternal task, Heracles used wit rather than strength to convince the Titan to resume his burden, showing that wisdom and cunning were as valuable as physical might. The 12th and final labor took Heracles to the very gates of the underworld, where he was commanded to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the realm of the dead. This was more than a physical challenge. It was a journey into the deepest mysteries of existence, a confrontation with mortality itself. Descending into Hades, Heracles walked paths that no living mortal had ever trod. He saw the shades of the dead, including fallen comrades from his many adventures, their ghostly forms reminding him of the cost of heroism. He witnessed the eternal punishments of great sinners, understanding how his own moment of madness could have led him to such a fate. When he stood before Hades and Persephone, rulers of the dead, he made his request not as a demand but as a supplication. The god of the underworld, impressed by the hero's respectful approach, agreed to the loan of Cerberus on one condition: Heracles must subdue the beast, using no weapons, only his hands and his will. The confrontation with Cerberus was unlike any of his previous battles. Here was a creature of pure spiritual power, a guardian whose very existence maintained the boundary between life and death. Heracles approached the three-headed dog with calm determination, speaking to it in low, soothing tones, recognizing that this was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a guardian doing its duty. When his arms finally encircled the creature's necks, it was not a wrestling match, but almost a dance, a meeting of two forces that understood and respected each other. With Cerberus temporarily in tow, Heracles returned to the world of the living, completing his 12 labors and earning his freedom from servitude. But liberation from Eurystheus did not mean freedom from destiny. The hero's remaining years were filled with adventures, loves, and tragedies that tested his character in different ways. His marriage to Deianira brought him joy, but also led to his ultimate downfall when her jealousy, manipulated by the dying centaur Nessus, caused her to send him a shirt poisoned with the Hydra's blood. The irony was bitter. The weapon that would finally defeat the unconquerable hero was created from his own earlier victory. As the poison ate through his flesh, causing unbearable agony, Heracles faced his final choice. He could have raged against his fate, could have cursed the gods and the cruel destiny that brought him to this end. Instead, he chose to transform his death into one final heroic act. Building a funeral pyre on Mount Oeta, he lay down upon it willingly, asking his friend Philoctetes to light the flames. But even in death, Heracles transcended mortal limitations. As the flames consumed his mortal form, Zeus claimed his divine essence, bringing his son to Olympus as a full god. There, reconciled at last with Hera, he married Hebe, goddess of youth, and found the peace that had eluded him in mortal life. The story of Heracles teaches us that true heroism is not about being invulnerable, but about facing our vulnerabilities with courage. His greatest strength was not in his muscles, but in his willingness to keep striving for redemption even after his worst failures. In our own lives, when we face tasks that seem impossible, when we must atone for our mistakes, when we carry burdens that feel too heavy to bear, we can remember the hero who showed us that every labor, no matter how difficult, can be completed with persistence, wisdom, and the support of those who believe in us. Let your mind drift now from the labors of Heracles to the shores of ancient Troy, where waves eternally whisper the name of the greatest warrior who ever lived. Achilles, swift-footed son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, was born under the shadow of prophecy and the blessing of divine blood. In the silver-blue depths of the ocean, Thetis had received a vision that would haunt her motherly heart forever. Her son would face a choice: a long life of peaceful obscurity or a brief existence crowned with everlasting glory. Knowing that her beloved child would inevitably choose honor over longevity, she sought to protect him through any means possible. Picture the infant Achilles in his mother's arms as she carried him to the river Styx, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead. Holding him by his heel, she dipped his tiny form into the sacred waters, hoping to make his flesh invulnerable to mortal weapons. The dark waters swirled around the child, imbuing every part of his body with supernatural resilience. Every part except that small section of heel where his mother's fingers maintained their protective grip. As Achilles grew from infancy to boyhood, his education took place not in the civilized halls of his father's palace, but in the wild mountains where the centaur Chiron maintained his academy for heroes. Under the ancient creature's tutelage, the young prince learned not only the arts of war, but also music, medicine, and the deeper mysteries of honorable conduct. Chiron recognized in his student a spirit that burned brighter and hotter than others, a soul that would inevitably consume itself in the pursuit of excellence. With patient wisdom, the centaur tried to temper that flame without extinguishing it, teaching Achilles that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from knowing when to stay one's hand. He learned to play the lyre with the same precision he would later bring to spear work, understanding that harmony and discord were both necessary elements in the symphony of existence. In those mountain meadows, Achilles also met Patroclus, the gentle companion who would become closer to him than a brother. Their friendship was one of perfect understanding, Patroclus's calm wisdom balancing Achilles' fierce intensity each making the other more complete. They trained together, ate together, shared their dreams and fears under star-filled skies, creating a bond that would ultimately shape the destiny of nations. When the ships began gathering at Aulis for the great expedition against Troy, Thetis made one last desperate attempt to save her son from his prophesied fate. She spirited him away to the court of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros, disguising him as a maiden among the king's daughters. For a time, Achilles lived this hidden life, his warrior's nature suppressed beneath feminine garments and gentle pursuits. But destiny is not so easily thwarted. Odysseus, whose keen mind could penetrate any deception, came to Skyros with gifts for the royal household. Among the jewelry and fine fabrics, he placed a sword and shield, then arranged for a trumpet to sound the call to battle. While the true maidens fled in terror, Achilles instinctively seized the weapons, his warrior's nature revealing itself in that moment of simulated crisis. Standing revealed at last, Achilles faced the choice his mother had tried so hard to help him avoid. He could return to his disguise, live a long and peaceful life among the women of Skyros, perhaps even find contentment in obscurity. Or he could join the expedition to Troy, knowing that glory awaited, but that his life would be measured in months rather than decades. In his heart, he had already made the choice long ago, from the moment Chiron first placed a spear in his hands. From the first time he felt the surge of joy that came with perfect combat, he had been walking the path toward Troy. The war at Troy had already raged for 9 long years when our story truly begins. 9 years of siege and sally, of heroes falling and cities burning. Achilles had proven himself the greatest warrior on either side, his bronze spear dealing death to Trojan champions, while his very presence on the battlefield inspired his comrades to impossible feats of valor. But even heroes are human, and in the distribution of spoils after the sack of Chryse, Achilles found himself in conflict with Agamemnon, the arrogant king who led the Greek forces. When Agamemnon was forced to return his captive, the priest's daughter Chryseis, he compensated himself by seizing Briseis, the woman who had been awarded to Achilles. The insult cut deeper than any physical wound. It was not merely the loss of a prize, but the public humiliation, the suggestion that Achilles' contributions to the war effort were worth less than those of the High King. In that moment, the greatest warrior of the age made a decision that would cost countless lives and forever change the course of the war. Fulrofer and Selv, he withdrew from battle, taking his followers with him to sit beside their ships while Troy's walls still stood unconquered. Day after day, Achilles sat by the wine-dark sea, playing his lyre and singing songs of heroes from ages past, while on the plain beyond, his former comrades fought and died without his spear to support them. His mother Thetis, feeling her son's anguish, petitioned Zeus himself to honor Achilles by allowing the Trojans to drive the Greeks back to their ships. The king of gods, bound by his promise to the sea goddess, began to turn the tide of battle against the Greeks. As the war turned against them, the Greek leaders came to Achilles with rich gifts and humble apologies, begging him to return to the fight. Agamemnon offered treasures beyond counting, tripods and cauldrons of gold, swift horses, beautiful women, even his own daughter in marriage with a dowry fit for a king. But Achilles' anger had hardened into something deeper than mere resentment. He had looked into the heart of the war and seen its futility, the way that pride and greed transformed noble intentions into meaningless slaughter. All the wealth of Troy cannot bring back a man's life once his breath has left his lips, he told the embassy, his words carrying the weight of one who had dealt death to so many that he had begun to question the value of the glory he sought. In his refusal to return, we see not just wounded pride, but a deeper philosophical crisis. Wise, the realization that even perfect achievement in war might be a hollow victory. But the war continued its relentless course, and eventually the fighting came to the very edge of the Greek camp. Hector, noble prince of Troy and its greatest defender, led his warriors in an assault that threatened to burn the Greek ships and end the expedition in total defeat. Even then, Achilles held to his decision, though his heart ached to hear the sounds of battle so close to his own dwelling. It was Patroclus who broke the deadlock, his gentle nature unable to bear the sight of Greek suffering while his dearest friend nursed his wounded honor. In tears, he begged Achilles to either return to battle himself or at least lend his armor and troops to the defense of their comrades. "If some prophecy holds you back," Patroclus pleaded, "then send me in your place, wearing your armor, so that the Trojans will think you have returned and be struck with fear." Achilles, moved by his friend's anguish and his own growing horror at the carnage, agreed to this compromise. He helped Patroclus into his own divine armor, placed his own spear in his companion's hands, and gave him command of the fearsome Myrmidons. But as they prepared for battle, a shadow of foreboding crossed Achilles' heart, and he made Patroclus promise to do no more than drive the Trojans back from the ships, not to pursue them to Troy's walls. The ruse worked perfectly at first. When the Trojans saw the familiar armor and the dreaded Myrmidons charging across the plain, they fled in panic, believing that Achilles himself had returned to battle. Patroclus fought with inspired courage, saving the Greek ships and driving Hector's forces back toward the city. But success bred overconfidence, and despite his promise, he pursued the fleeing Trojans toward Troy itself. There, beneath the city's ancient walls, Patroclus met his fate. Hector, rallying his men for a final stand, engaged the disguised warrior in single combat. The fight was long and bitter, but in the end, it was Hector's spear that found its mark, piercing through Achilles' armor to still the generous heart that beat beneath. As Patroclus fell, his dying breath carried a prophecy that Hector too would soon follow him to the house of Hades. When word reached Achilles that his beloved companion was dead, the hero's anguish transformed into something terrible and magnificent. His grief was so profound that it shook the earth, his cries of mourning so piercing that they reached the depths of the ocean where his mother dwelt. Thetis rose from the waves with her sister sea nymphs, surrounding her son with cool comfort as he wept tears that seemed to flow from the very springs of sorrow. But grief in Achilles quickly transformed into rage, a wrath so pure and terrible that it transcended human emotion and became something divine in its intensity. All thoughts of his quarrel with Agamemnon vanished, swept away by the single burning need for vengeance. He would return to battle, not for glory or honor or the cause of the Greeks, but to make Hector pay for taking the one person in the world he loved above all others. Thetis, knowing that her son's return to battle meant the fulfillment of his doom, nevertheless provided him with new armor forged by Hephaestus himself. The divine smith had crafted a shield that showed the entire world in miniature, cities at peace and war, the cycle of seasons, the dance of stars, all of human life captured in bronze and gold and silver. It was as if the gods wanted Achilles to understand the full scope of what he was choosing to leave behind. When Achilles strode onto the battlefield in his new armor, the very ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. His fury was so evident that veteran warriors on both sides stepped aside, recognizing that this was no longer merely human combat, but something approaching divine retribution. He carved a path of destruction through the Trojan ranks, his spear finding its mark with every thrust, until the plain ran red with blood, and the river Scamander itself cried out in protest at the carnage. Finally, inevitably, Achilles found himself face to face with Hector beneath the walls of Troy. The Trojan prince, for all his courage, felt his heart quail before the terrible light in Achilles' eyes. 3 times he ran around the city walls, seeking to delay the confrontation, while his parents and wife watched in anguish from the battlements above. But destiny would not be denied. At last, Hector turned to face his pursuer, and the 2 greatest warriors of their age met in combat that would be remembered as long as men told tales of heroism. They fought with skill that bordered on artistry, each move perfectly calculated, each strike a masterpiece of timing and technique. But in the end, it was Achilles' divine armor that made the difference. His spear found the one gap in Hector's defense, piercing the throat of Troy's noble defender. Even in victory, Achilles found no peace. His rage demanded not just Hector's death, but his humiliation, and in his madness, he tied the Trojan prince's body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, while Hector's family watched in horror. For 12 days he repeated this desecration, trying to find in cruelty the satisfaction that eluded him in mere killing. But revenge, he discovered, was a hollow victory. Patroclus remained dead, and no amount of violence could bring him back or ease the emptiness in Achilles' heart. He had achieved everything a warrior could desire. He had proven himself the greatest fighter of his age, had slain his enemy, had won glory that would last forever. Yet all of it felt meaningless without his companion to share in the triumph. It was Priam, the aged king of Troy and father of the slain Hector, who finally reached the humanity buried beneath Achilles' fury. Guided by the gods, the old man slipped through the Greek lines by night and came alone to Achilles' tent, where he knelt before his son's killer and begged for the return of Hector's body. "Think of your own father," Priam pleaded, his voice breaking with a grief that transcended enmity. "He is old as I am old, and he too will mourn when he learns of your death, for surely you know that your own end approaches." In those words, Achilles heard not the voice of an enemy, but the universal language of loss that connects all who love and all who must eventually say goodbye. Together, the young warrior and the old king wept, Achilles for Patroclus and for his own father whom he would never see again, Priam for Hector and for the city that would fall with its greatest defender gone. In that moment of shared sorrow, they transcended the artificial divisions of war and found their common humanity. Achilles not only returned Hector's body but helped prepare it for burial, honoring his fallen enemy with the same care he had lavished on Patroclus. The war continued, but Achilles had been changed by his encounter with Priam. He fought with the same skill but without the same fury, as if part of him had already begun its journey to the underworld. When Paris's arrow, guided by Apollo, found the one vulnerable spot on his body, that heel where his mother's fingers had prevented the waters of Styx from touching him, Achilles faced death not with surprise but with something approaching relief. As his life ebbed away, Achilles understood at last the true meaning of the choice he had made so many years before. Glory was not about being remembered by strangers in distant lands, but about the intensity with which one chose to live. He had compressed a lifetime of experience into his brief years, had loved deeply, fought magnificently, and suffered profoundly. In choosing a short life of perfect intensity over a long one of peaceful mediocrity, he had discovered what it truly meant to be fully alive. The lesson of Achilles echoes across the centuries to remind us that heroism is not about being fearless, but about acting despite our fears. His story teaches us that the price of excellence is often isolation, that great gifts carry great burdens, and that sometimes the very qualities that make us extraordinary also make us vulnerable. But most importantly, it shows us that even in our darkest moments of rage and grief, we retain the capacity for compassion, and that recognizing our shared humanity with our enemies can be the most heroic act of all. Let your thoughts drift now from the burning plains of Troy to the wine-dark seas of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of hero begins his greatest adventure. Odysseus of Ithaca, beloved of Athena, master of cunning, the man of many ways and many wiles, stands at the threshold between the age of open warfare and the age of subtle strategy. Unlike Heracles with his overwhelming strength, or Achilles with his perfect skill in battle, Odysseus represents the triumph of intelligence over adversity, the power of adaptation over brute force. His very name has become synonymous with the long journey home, but his true heroism lies not in his destination, but in how he chooses to meet each challenge along the way. Picture him as Troy finally falls, standing amid the ruins of the great city, his mind already turning from the glories of conquest to the practical problems of return. While other heroes divide the spoils and plan victory celebrations, Odysseus studies the horizon and calculates wins, knowing that the real test of a warrior is not how he wins battles, but how he survives their aftermath. The 12 ships of Ithaca set sail from Troy's burning harbor with high hopes and favorable winds. For most of the Greek fleet, the journey home would be measured in weeks or months. But Odysseus, in his pride and cleverness, had made an enemy of Poseidon, god of the seas, and the earth shaker would extract a terrible price for the hero's hubris. The first challenge came at Ismarus, city of the Cicones, where Odysseus's men, drunk on victory and wine, ignored their leader's warnings to leave quickly after their raid. What should have been a simple resupply became a costly battle when the Cicones allies arrived, teaching the Ithacans their first lesson about the price of overconfidence. 6 men from each ship were lost, and Odysseus learned that leadership in peacetime required different skills than command in war. Driven by storms to the mysterious land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus encountered his first supernatural challenge. The inhabitants of this dreamy realm offered his scouts the honey-sweet fruit of forgetfulness, which erased all desire to return home and filled the mind with gentle contentment. Here was a test, not of courage, but of purpose. Would the hero choose easy pleasure over difficult duty? When his advance party failed to return, Odysseus went ashore himself and found them sitting peacefully among the lotus eaters, their eyes unfocused, their memories of home fading like morning mist. He could have tasted the fruit himself, could have ended his struggles in that place of eternal, mindless peace. Instead, he bound his men and dragged them weeping back to the ships, choosing the hard path of responsibility over the soft path of escape. This first trial established the pattern that would define Odysseus's entire journey, the constant tension between the desire for ease and the demands of duty, between the temptation to abandon his goals and the stubborn determination to see them through. In our own lives, when we face the lotus eaters of distraction and comfortable numbness, we can remember the hero who chose to remain awake and aware, no matter how painful that awareness might be. The most famous episode of Odysseus's wanderings began with what seemed like simple curiosity. Seeing smoke rising from a large island, the hero decided to investigate, hoping to find supplies and perhaps receive the hospitality that civilized peoples owed to travelers. Taking only his best men and a skin of potent wine, he approached the cave of Polyphemus, the mighty Cyclops, son of Poseidon. The cave was enormous, filled with the wealth of a giant shepherd, cheeses the size of shields, pens full of lambs and kids, milk pails tall as a man. Odysseus's companions urged him to take what they needed and flee quickly, but the hero's curiosity overcame his caution. He wanted to meet this creature, to test his wits against something beyond normal human experience. It was a decision that would cost him dearly and set in motion the divine wrath that would prolong his journey for 10 long years. When Polyphemus returned with his flocks, he sealed the cave with a massive boulder that 20 teams of oxen could not move. Discovering the intruders, the Cyclops seized 2 of Odysseus's men and dashed their brains out against the cave wall before devouring them raw. The hero's first instinct was to draw his sword and slay the monster, but his quick mind realized that without the Cyclops to move the stone, they would all die trapped in the cave. Instead, Odysseus devised a plan that showcased both his strategic thinking and his understanding of psychology. Over the course of 3 days, he befriended the Cyclops with gifts of wine, gradually earning enough trust to learn the giant's habits and weaknesses. When Polyphemus asked his name, Odysseus replied, "Nobody," a deception that would prove crucial to their escape. On the 3rd night, when the Cyclops had drunk himself into a stupor, Odysseus and his surviving men heated a massive wooden stake in the fire and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye. The giant's screams brought his neighbors running, but when they asked what was wrong, he could only cry, "Nobody is hurting me, nobody is killing me." Thinking he was merely ill or mad, the other Cyclopes departed, leaving Polyphemus alone with his agony and rage. The blinding was only half the battle. They still needed to escape the sealed cave. With brilliant improvisation, Odysseus lashed his men under the bellies of the Cyclops' rams, while he himself clung to the underside of the largest and most magnificent beast. When morning came and Polyphemus opened the cave to let his flocks graze, he felt the back of each animal, but never thought to check underneath. Free at last and safely aboard his ship, Odysseus made the fateful error that would define the rest of his journey. Unable to resist boasting of his cleverness, he revealed his true name and lineage to the blinded giant. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, sacker of cities," he shouted across the waves, his pride overcoming the prudence that had served him so well in the cave. Polyphemus responded with a prayer to his father Poseidon, calling down a curse that would haunt Odysseus for years to come. "Grant that Odysseus may never reach his home, but if the fates decree he must, let him arrive alone and late in a stranger's ship to find trouble waiting in his hall." The sea god heard his son's plea and began to turn the very oceans against the hero who had dared to harm his offspring. This episode reveals one of Odysseus's greatest strengths and his most dangerous weakness. His intelligence and adaptability allowed him to solve seemingly impossible problems, but his pride in that intelligence often created new difficulties. The hero who could deceive a cyclops could not resist the temptation to claim credit for his deception, teaching us that sometimes the hardest victory to win is victory over our own need for recognition. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, welcomed Odysseus with great hospitality and listened with fascination to the tale of Troy's fall. As a parting gift, the god gave the hero a leather bag containing all the adverse winds, keeping only the gentle west wind free to carry the Ithacan ships home. For 9 days they sailed in perfect conditions, and Ithaca's familiar mountains appeared on the horizon. But Odysseus, exhausted by constant vigilance and the burden of leadership, finally succumbed to sleep just as their homeland came into view. His men, who had grown suspicious of the mysterious bag their captain guarded so carefully, convinced themselves it must contain treasure he was hiding from them. While their leader slept, they opened the bag, releasing all the pent-up storms at once. The ships were blown back across the entire Mediterranean, farther from home than when they had started. When they returned to Aeolus's island, the god refused to help them again, declaring that such misfortune could only mean the displeasure of the gods. Odysseus learned a bitter lesson about the limits of individual heroism. Even the cleverest leader cannot succeed if his followers lack trust and discipline. At the next landfall, Odysseus displayed the caution he had learned from bitter experience. Instead of taking all his ships into the narrow harbor as the other captains did, he moored his own vessel outside the inlet and climbed a high rock to survey the land. What he saw filled him with dread, giants moving among the cliffs and his companions' ships trapped like fish in a barrel. The Laestrygonians proved to be cannibals as well as giants, raining boulders down on the trapped ships and spearing the sailors like fish. Of the 12 ships that had left Troy, only Odysseus's own vessel escaped, the hero's hard-won wisdom saving at least some of his men from the fate that claimed their companions. As they rowed desperately away from that harbor of horrors, Odysseus understood that his journey was becoming something more than a simple voyage home. It was a test of survival against forces that seemed determined to destroy him. The island of Aeaea appeared peaceful after the terrors they had faced, its green hills and sheltered coves promising rest and safety. But Odysseus had learned not to trust appearances, and when he divided his men into 2 groups to explore the island, he kept his own party hidden while Eurylochus led the other inland. They found a beautiful palace where the sorceress Circe welcomed them with wine and food, her voice sweet as honey as she invited them to feast and rest. But her hospitality was a trap. The wine was drugged, and as the men succumbed to its effects, she touched each with her wand and transformed them into swine, their human minds trapped within animal bodies. Only Eurylochus escaped, having suspected treachery, and waited outside the palace. He returned to Odysseus with the terrible news, begging his captain to set sail immediately before they too fell victim to the sorceress's power. But Odysseus could not abandon his men, even though attempting their rescue seemed like certain doom. As he approached Circe's palace alone, Hermes appeared to him in the form of a young man, offering divine assistance in the form of a magical herb called moly. With its protection, Odysseus would be immune to Circe's magic, able to face her on equal terms. The god's help came with a warning. The sorceress was dangerous, but she was also knowledgeable, and if properly approached, she might become an ally rather than an enemy. Armed with the divine herb and his own considerable charm, Odysseus entered Circe's hall and allowed her to offer him the drugged wine. When her magic failed to affect him and he drew his sword, threatening her life unless she restored his men, the sorceress recognized that she faced no ordinary mortal. Her fear quickly transformed into respect, then admiration, and finally into something approaching love. Circe not only restored Odysseus's men to human form, but offered all the castaways the hospitality of her island for as long as they wished to stay. After so many hardships and dangers, the offer was irresistible to a year of peace, plenty, and pleasure, with no threats beyond the horizon and no pressing need to face the perils of the sea. For 12 months, they lived like kings in Circe's palace, feasting on ambrosia and nectar, listening to the sorceress's stories of gods and monsters, gradually forgetting the urgency that had once driven them toward home. It was a subtler trap than the lotus eater's fruit, more dangerous because it felt like choice rather than compulsion. Only when his men finally approached him, begging him to remember their families and their duty, did Odysseus realize how close they had come to abandoning their quest entirely. When he announced their intention to leave, Circe did not try to prevent their departure, but she did warn him of the trials that lay ahead. The path home led through dangers that no mortal had ever survived. The sirens whose song could drive men mad with longing, the clashing rocks that crushed ships to splinters, the strait guarded by Scylla and Charybdis, where no vessel could pass without terrible loss. But first, she told him, he must make a journey that no living man had ever attempted. To learn the secret of his return, he must sail to the very edge of the world and descend into the realm of Hades, there to consult the spirit of the prophet Theseus. Only the dead could tell him how to appease Poseidon's wrath and find his way back to the world of the living. At the edge of the world, where the river ocean flows around the rim of all things, Odysseus performed the dark ritual Circe had taught him. He dug a pit with his sword and filled it with the blood of sacrificed animals, creating a beacon that would draw the spirits of the dead like moths to flame. As the ghostly forms began to gather, attracted by the scent of life, Odysseus held them back with his drawn blade, waiting for the prophet to appear. Theseus came at last, his blind eyes seeing truths hidden from the living. He drank deeply of the blood offering, and his shade grew solid enough to speak with the voice of prophecy. "Your path home lies through great suffering," the seer warned, "but if you can master your pride and control your men's desires, you may yet see Ithaca again." The ghost revealed the secret of Poseidon's anger and the price of forgiveness. Odysseus must journey far inland after reaching home, carrying an oar until he found people who had never seen the sea. There he must sacrifice to Poseidon and establish the god's worship, earning peace through humility and service. But most importantly, Tiresias warned him about the island of the sun god, where cattle sacred to Helios grazed in eternal pastures. If his men harmed even one of those beasts, they would never see home again. Other shades crowded forward to speak with the living hero, his mother Anticlea, who had died of grief during his long absence; Achilles, who confessed that he would rather be the poorest laborer on earth than king of all the dead; Agamemnon, who warned him to trust no one, not even his wife, when he finally returned home. Each encounter deepened Odysseus's understanding of the price of his journey and strengthened his determination to see it through to the end. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus prepared his ship for the encounter with the sirens, those creatures whose beautiful voices could lure sailors to destruction on the rocks surrounding their island. He ordered his men to plug their ears with soft wax, then had them bind him tightly to the mast with strict instructions not to release him no matter how he pleaded or commanded. As they sailed past the Sirens' Isle, Odysseus heard their song and understood why it was so deadly. They sang not of simple pleasures but of knowledge. They knew all that had happened at Troy, all that was happening in the world, all that would come to pass. They offered the hero perfect understanding, complete wisdom, the answers to every question that had ever puzzled him. Against such a temptation, physical bonds were nothing. He strained against his ropes with superhuman strength, screaming orders for his men to free him. But his companions, their ears sealed against temptation, rode steadily onward until the deadly song faded into the distance. Odysseus became the only man who had ever heard the siren's song and lived, but the knowledge came at a price. He would spend the rest of his life wondering what truths he might have learned if he had given in to their call. Sometimes the greatest heroism lies not in seeking knowledge, but in accepting the limits of what we can safely know. The final test of the journey came at the narrow strait, where two legendary terrors waited: Scylla, the six-headed monster who snatched sailors from passing ships, and Charybdis, the whirlpool that could swallow entire vessels. Circe had warned Odysseus that no ship could pass this way without loss, and he faced the hardest decision a leader ever confronts: which of his men to sacrifice so that others might live. He chose to steer closer to Scylla's cliff rather than risk the whirlpool that would destroy them all. As they rode through the strait, the monster's 6 heads struck like serpents, each seizing one of his companions. Odysseus could only watch in anguish as his men called out to him, even as they were lifted from the deck, their voices echoing his name until Scylla's cave swallowed them forever. That sight, he would later say, was the most pitiful thing my eyes ever looked on in all my sufferings as I explored the paths of the sea. Leadership, he learned, sometimes requires making choices that will haunt you forever, accepting losses that seem unbearable in order to prevent even greater catastrophe. The hero who saves some must live with the knowledge of those he could not save. Exhausted by their trials, the surviving crew begged to put ashore at the next island they encountered, despite Odysseus's warnings that this was the sacred Isle of Helios, where they were forbidden to harm any living creature. For a month they were trapped there by contrary winds, living on the supplies Circe had provided, watching their stores dwindle day by day. When the food finally ran out and the men faced starvation, Odysseus went inland to pray for divine guidance, hoping that one of the gods might show them a way to escape their predicament without violating the sun god's sanctuary. But exhaustion overcame him, and while he slept, his starving companions made the fatal decision that would seal their doom. Led by Eurylochus, they slaughtered the finest cattle in Helios's herd, convincing themselves that death by divine punishment was preferable to slow starvation. "If we die," Eurylochus argued, "it's better to die quickly beneath the waves than waste away here like cowards." It was the logic of desperation, the reasoning of men who had endured too much and lost the faith that had sustained them through earlier trials. When Odysseus awoke to the smell of roasting meat, he knew that their fate was sealed. The cattle's hides crawled on the ground as if still alive, the meat lowed on the spits like living beasts, and the very air was filled with portents of divine wrath. Helios petitioned Zeus for vengeance, threatening to take his light to the underworld if the sacrilege went unpunished. When they finally put to sea again, Zeus's thunderbolts split their ship like kindling. Odysseus watched his remaining companions drown in the dark waters, their voices calling his name until the waves silenced them forever. Only he survived, clinging to the mast and keel that he had lashed together into a makeshift raft, alone at last on the vast expanse of the wine-dark sea. For 9 days he drifted, the currents carrying him back toward the whirlpool of Charybdis in cruel irony. When the monster sucked his raft down into the depths, he saved himself by grabbing the branch of a fig tree that grew on the cliff above, hanging there like a bat until the whirlpool disgorged the wreckage hours later. It was a victory of pure endurance, the triumph of a will that refused to accept defeat even when hope seemed lost. 10 days after the destruction of his ship, the currents delivered him to Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso, whose name means the concealer. For 7 years she held him there, not as a prisoner but as a beloved, offering him immortality and eternal youth if he would consent to remain with her forever. But Odysseus, though he accepted her love and comfort, never stopped longing for his mortal home and his mortal wife. At last, moved by Athena's pleas, Zeus commanded Calypso to release her captive. She helped him build a raft and provided supplies for the final stage of his journey, though she warned him that greater sufferings awaited him even if he reached Ithaca. Poseidon, discovering that his enemy was once again at sea, sent one final storm that destroyed the raft and left Odysseus swimming for his life in mountainous waves. But the sea nymph Ino took pity on him, giving him a magical veil that would bear him safely to shore. For 2 days and nights he swam through the storm, his strength sustained only by his unquenchable desire to see home again. When he finally crawled onto the beach of Scheria, he was naked, exhausted, covered in brine and seaweed, looking more like a shipwrecked beggar than the great hero of Troy. The Phaeacians, a people blessed by the gods with magical ships and generous hearts, found him sleeping in the shelter of olive bushes, and took him to their king. There, in the palace of Alcinous, Odysseus told the full story of his wanderings, his tale so moving that even the hardened warriors wept to hear it. The king, recognizing that he hosted one of the greatest heroes of the age, provided him with a ship and crew to carry him safely to Ithaca at last. But even reaching Ithaca was not the end of Odysseus's trials. In his 20-year absence, his palace had been overrun by suitors seeking to marry his wife Penelope and claim his throne. These men had consumed his wealth, abused his servants, and threatened his son, believing that Odysseus would never return from his long wandering. Disguised as a beggar through Athena's magic, Odysseus entered his own hall and saw the extent of the damage wrought by his absence. But he also saw that Penelope had remained faithful through all the years of uncertainty, using her intelligence and cunning to delay the suitors while hoping against hope for her husband's return. In her loyalty and cleverness, he recognized a kindred spirit, someone whose mind could match his own. The final test came when Penelope announced that she would marry whichever suitor could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. One by one, the suitors failed, unable even to bend the massive weapon that had been crafted specifically for the hero's strength. When the disguised Odysseus asked to try, they mocked the ragged beggar, not knowing they were addressing the master of the very weapon they could not wield. With easy grace, Odysseus strung the bow and sent an arrow straight through all 12 axe heads, then turned the weapon on the suitors who had despoiled his home. The slaughter that followed was swift and complete, but it was not mere revenge. It was the restoration of justice to a house that had fallen into chaos during the absence of its rightful master. The story of Odysseus teaches us that intelligence without wisdom is dangerous, but that wisdom earned through suffering is the most precious treasure a human being can possess. His journey was not just a geographical odyssey, but a spiritual pilgrimage, each trial teaching him something essential about leadership, loyalty, and the price of pride. When he finally revealed himself to Penelope, proving his identity through knowledge of their marriage bed carved from a living olive tree, the hero who had wandered for 10 years understood that the greatest victories are not won through strength or cleverness, but through the patient maintenance of love and loyalty across time and distance. Home, he learned, is not a place but a relationship, not a destination but a choice we make every day to honor our deepest commitments. In our own lives, when we face the sirens of easy answers, the whirlpools of overwhelming challenges, the monsters that threaten to destroy everything we hold dear, we can remember the hero who showed us that intelligence guided by wisdom and tempered by compassion can overcome any obstacle. The path home may be longer than we expect and harder than we imagine, but if we hold fast to what matters most, we can find our way through any storm. In the gentle darkness of your imagination, travel now to the sun-blessed hills of ancient Attica, where a different kind of heroism was born. Theseus, the great king of Athens, represents not the individual excellence of Heracles or Achilles, but the triumph of civilization over chaos, of justice over mere strength, of democratic ideals over tyrannical rule. His very birth embodied the duality that would define his character, child of both mortal and divine heritage, but also heir to both earthly kingship and celestial wisdom. His mother Aethra lay with two lovers on the same night, Aegeus, king of Athens, who desperately needed an heir, and Poseidon, god of the seas, who was drawn by her beauty and intelligence. From this dual parentage came a hero who could bridge different worlds, understanding both human limitations and divine possibilities. Picture the infant Theseus in his mother's arms as she walked the shores of Troezen, where gentle waves whispered secrets of the future and olive groves rustled with portents of greatness to come. Before departing for Athens, Aegeus had hidden a sword and sandals beneath a massive boulder, telling Aethra that when their child grew strong enough to move the stone, he should claim these tokens and journey to Athens to take his place as heir. Under his grandfather Pythias's guidance, young Theseus received an education that emphasized not just physical prowess, but moral reasoning and civic responsibility. The old king, wisest of his generation, taught his grandson that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy. In the palace courtyard, among the fountains and flowering gardens, the boy learned that leadership was service, not privilege. As Theseus grew to manhood, he displayed the divine strength inherited from Poseidon, but tempered it with the human compassion he learned from his mortal family. When local bullies threatened the weak, he intervened not with overwhelming force, but with just enough strength to restore balance. When faced with complex disputes, he sought solutions that served justice rather than mere expediency. The day came when, at age 16, Theseus easily lifted the boulder that had stymied grown men, claiming his father's sword and sandals as proof of his royal heritage. But when the time came to journey to Athens, he faced his first great choice, the safe sea route that his mother and grandfather urged upon him, or the dangerous overland path that was plagued by bandits and monsters. True to his heroic nature, Theseus chose the dangerous path, seeing in its perils not obstacles to be avoided, but opportunities to prove that strength could serve justice. "If I am to rule Athens," he declared, "I must first make the roads safe for common travelers." His mother wept to see him go, but she also felt pride that her son would face danger not for glory, but for the good of those who could not protect themselves. The first challenger he encountered was Perseus, the club-bearer, a giant who killed travelers with a massive bronze club and robbed their corpses. But Theseus did not simply slay the monster. He turned the brute's own weapon against him, then claimed the club as his own, transforming a tool of oppression into a symbol of protection for the innocent. This victory established a pattern that would define all his later triumphs. Evil weapons turned to good purpose, strength used to defend rather than destroy. At the Isthmus of Corinth, he faced Sinis the pine bender, who would tie his victims between two bent pine trees and release them to be torn apart. Theseus subjected the torturer to his own cruel method, but more importantly, he freed all the prisoners Sinis had been saving for future torment and established a code of justice that would govern that stretch of road for generations to come. Each encounter along the road taught Theseus something essential about the nature of true justice. The Crommyonian sow, a monstrous boar that terrorized the countryside, fell to his spear, but not before he had organized the local farmers to help track it, teaching them that they need not cower before threats when they work together. Sciron, who forced travelers to wash his feet before kicking them off a cliff to feed a giant turtle, met his end when Theseus turned his own trick against him. But the hero also established a shrine at that spot, transforming a place of terror into a sanctuary where travelers could rest safely and offer thanks for their safe passage. Evil, he understood, left wounds in the world that needed healing, not just punishment. The wrestler Cercyon, who killed opponents in unfair matches, found himself outmatched by Theseus's superior technique and noble bearing. Instead of simply defeating him, the hero established rules for fair competition, creating the foundations of athletic contests that would honor strength while protecting participants. Violence transformed into sport, chaos organized into civilization. This was the gift Theseus brought wherever he traveled. The final and most psychologically complex challenge came at the house of Procrustes, who offered hospitality to weary travelers, but then fitted them to his iron bed by stretching the short and cutting down the tall until all were the same size. Here was evil disguised as kindness, violence masquerading as order, the corrupt logic that would sacrifice individual humanity to abstract ideals of uniformity. Theseus recognized immediately that this was not mere banditry, but something more sinister, the tendency of tyrants to force all people into the same mold regardless of their natural differences. When he subjected Procrustes to his own bed, he was not simply enacting revenge, but making a philosophical statement about the importance of respecting individual nature rather than forcing conformity. With the road cleared of its terrors, Theseus arrived in Athens not as a conquering warrior, but as a liberator who had made travel safe for all who would come after him. He had proven that heroism need not be solitary, that true strength could create lasting benefits for entire communities rather than just winning momentary glory for oneself. King Achilles did not immediately recognize his son, seeing only a young warrior whose growing reputation might threaten his throne. The sorceress Medea, who had become the king's wife after fleeing Corinth, sensed the danger this newcomer represented to her position and convinced Achilles to poison the stranger at a welcoming feast. But as Theseus drew his father's sword to cut his meat, recognition flashed between them like lightning. Achilles struck the poisoned cup from his son's hand, and father and son embraced while Medea fled the palace, her schemes thwarted by the very tokens she had failed to recognize. It was a moment of joy, but also of sadness, as both men realized how many years had been lost to separation and suspicion. Theseus's first great trial as Prince of Athens came when the tribute ships arrived from Crete, demanding their terrible cargo of 7 young men and 7 young women to feed the Minotaur in its labyrinth. This ancient debt, imposed after an earlier war, represented everything Theseus despised: the strong preying upon the weak, the sacrifice of innocent lives to maintain an unjust peace. When the lots were drawn and the victims chosen, Theseus saw the anguish in their families' faces and made a decision that would define his reign. He volunteered to take the place of one of the condemned youths, declaring that if Athens must send its children to die, their prince would share that fate. It was not reckless bravery, but calculated leadership. He understood that a ruler who would not risk his own life had no right to demand sacrifice from his subjects. King Achilles begged his son to reconsider, knowing that this might mean the end of his royal line. But Theseus had made his choice, and with it came a promise. If he succeeded in slaying the Minotaur, he would change the ship's black sails to white on his return, signaling victory from afar. If the sails remained black, Aegeus would know that his son had joined the monster's victims in death. In the palace of King Minos at Knossos, Theseus faced political dangers as complex as any physical monster. The Cretan court was a maze of intrigue and hidden loyalties, where a wrong word could mean death and trust was a luxury few could afford. But among the courtiers and diplomats, one figure stood out: Ariadne, daughter of Minos, whose intelligence and compassion had survived the corrupting influence of absolute power. When she first saw the Athenian prince standing proudly among the tribute victims, refusing to show fear, even in the face of certain death, something stirred in her heart that was deeper than mere attraction. Here was someone who valued honor above life, who would sacrifice himself for others rather than let them die in his place. In a world where power too often meant cruelty, she recognized a different kind of strength. The Labyrinth was more than a prison. It was a masterpiece of architecture designed by the genius Daedalus, so complex that even its creator could barely navigate its passages. Ariadne knew that even if Theseus could defeat the Minotaur, he would die lost in the maze unless someone helped him find his way back to the entrance. Her gift of thread was more than a practical aid. It was a symbol of trust, a lifeline connecting two souls across the chasm of political enmity. The entrance to the labyrinth yawned like the mouth of Hades itself, carved from black stone and decorated with scenes of the monster's previous victims. As Theseus descended into the maze, following passages that curved and twisted according to some mad logic of their own, he felt the weight of all Athens pressing upon his shoulders. Behind him, Ariadne's thread unreeled steadily, his only connection to the world of light and hope. The labyrinth was not silent. Strange echoes carried through its corridors, and sometimes he could hear the Minotaur itself, breathing heavily in some distant chamber, waiting with the patience of a creature that had never known defeat. The walls were stained with old blood and littered with the bones of heroes who had attempted this task before him, each one proof that strength alone was not enough to survive this place. But Theseus brought more than physical prowess to this confrontation. His experiences on the road to Athens had taught him that every monster had a weakness, that even the most terrible opponents could be defeated if one understood their nature and fought with intelligence rather than mere fury. The Minotaur was strong and savage, but it was also a prisoner in its own maze, driven mad by years of solitude and unnatural existence. When hero and monster finally met in the labyrinth's heart, their confrontation was both physical and symbolic, civilization facing the chaos it had created and abandoned. The Minotaur was not evil in any human sense, but rather a victim of the same political machinations that had condemned the Athenian youths to death. Yet sympathy could not stay Theseus's hand. Some evils, however pitiable their origins, could only be ended with courage and decisive action. The battle raged through the maze's central chamber, a space lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on walls carved with ancient symbols. The Minotaur's strength was immense, its rage bottomless, but Theseus fought with the precision of a surgeon and the determination of someone fighting not for personal glory, but for the lives of innocents. When his sword finally found the creature's heart, he felt no triumph, only sadness, for a life that had known nothing but darkness and violence. Following Ariadne's thread back through the labyrinth, Theseus gathered the other Athenian youths who had been spared to witness his confrontation with the Minotaur. Together, they made their way to the surface, where the princess waited with ships prepared for their escape. In the pre-dawn darkness, they sailed from Crete with the wind of freedom filling their sails and the promise of a new relationship between their peoples. But the joy of victory was complicated by the realities of love and duty. Ariadne had sacrificed everything to help him: her home, her family, her place in the only world she had ever known. Yet, as they journeyed toward Athens, Theseus began to realize that their love, however genuine, had been born in the extreme circumstances of life and death, and might not survive the mundane realities of daily existence. On the island of Naxos, where they stopped to rest and resupply, the god Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream, claiming Ariadne as his destined bride. The god's message was clear: the princess belonged to a divine realm, not to mortal politics, and her true destiny lay in transformation from earthly princess to immortal goddess. When Theseus sailed away, leaving Ariadne sleeping on the beach, he believed he was freeing her to achieve a greater destiny than he could offer. The return journey to Athens should have been a time of celebration, but Theseus found himself lost in contemplation of the choices he had made and their consequences. Victory over the Minotaur had been clear-cut, but the moral complexities of his relationship with Ariadne troubled him deeply. Had he acted honorably in leaving her, or had he simply chosen political expediency over personal loyalty? So absorbed was he in these reflections that he forgot the promise he had made to his father to change the ship's sails from black to white if he returned victorious. As the vessel approached Attica with its sails still dark, King Aegeus watched from a high cliff and saw what he believed was proof of his son's death. In his grief, the old king threw himself into the sea that would forever after bear his name. Theseus arrived home to find himself not just a victorious hero, but an accidental parricide, king of Athens through tragedy rather than celebration. The weight of unintended consequences would haunt him throughout his reign, teaching him that even the most heroic actions could carry unforeseen costs. Leadership, he learned, meant accepting responsibility not just for what you intended, but for what actually happened as a result of your choices. As king of Athens, Theseus faced the challenge of transforming a collection of competing tribes and villages into a unified city-state capable of defending itself and governing justly. But instead of ruling through force or divine right, he chose a revolutionary path, the gradual sharing of power with the people themselves. He established the Synoikismos, the unification of Attica under a single government, but did so through negotiation and persuasion rather than conquest. Each community that joined Athens retained its identity and customs while contributing to the common defense and governance. It was a delicate balance between unity and diversity, strength and freedom that would become the foundation of Athenian democracy. Theseus understood that lasting peace could not be imposed from above, but had to grow from the consent of the governed. He established courts where disputes could be settled through reason rather than force, created laws that applied equally to rich and poor, and gradually transferred many of his royal prerogatives to assemblies chosen by the citizens themselves. It was a slow process, requiring constant vigilance against both tyranny and chaos, but it created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a state that derived its authority from the will of its people. The greatest test of Theseus's unified Athens came when the Amazons, the warrior women of the Black Sea, invaded Attica in response to his marriage to their former queen, Antiope. This was not a conflict he had sought, but rather the consequence of complex relationships formed during his adventures with Heracles and other heroes. The Amazon invasion threatened to destroy everything he had built, but it also provided an opportunity to prove that his democratic ideals could survive the test of war. Instead of fighting the Amazons as a traditional king with a professional army, Theseus called upon the citizen soldiers of Athens to defend their homes and their new way of life. Farmers and craftsmen, merchants and philosophers took up arms not because they were commanded to, but because they chose to defend something they had helped create. The war was long and bitter, but it was won by people fighting for their own freedom rather than for their ruler's glory. The victory over the Amazons established Athens as a major power in the Greek world, but more importantly, it proved that democratic institutions could survive external threats without becoming tyrannical. Theseus resisted the temptation to use wartime powers to increase his authority, instead using the victory to further strengthen the institutions that shared power among the citizens. As Theseus aged, he continued to adventure with other heroes, participating in the hunt for the Caledonian boar and sailing with the Argonauts in search of the Golden Fleece. But these later exploits had a different character from his youthful labors. Where once he had fought monsters and bandits, now he sought to build alliances and establish relationships that would benefit Athens and promote justice throughout the Greek world. His friendship with Perseus, king of the Labyrinth, led to one of his greatest trials when they attempted to kidnap Persephone from the underworld. It was an act of hubris that resulted in their imprisonment in Hades until Heracles freed Theseus during his own descent to capture Cerberus. The experience taught the Athenian king that even democratic ideals could lead to overreach if not tempered by wisdom and respect for divine law. Theseus's innovations in governance made him enemies among traditional rulers who saw his democratic experiments as threats to their own authority. Within Athens itself, there were always those who preferred the certainty of autocratic rule to the messy compromises required by democratic participation. As he grew older, he found himself increasingly isolated, a reformer whose very successes created new problems and new opposition. The final years of his reign were marked by civil strife and political conspiracy, as various factions sought to manipulate the democratic institutions he had created for their own advantage. Eventually, he was driven from Athens by his own people, the victims of the same political processes he had established. He died in exile on the island of Scyros, pushed from a cliff by King Lycomedes, who feared that even in exile, the former king of Athens remained too dangerous to live. Yet, Theseus's true victory was not measured in personal success, but in the endurance of the institutions he had created. Long after his death, Athens remained a democracy, its people governing themselves through the assemblies and courts he had established. His example inspired other cities to experiment with self-governance, spreading the radical idea that ordinary citizens could be trusted with political power. The story of Theseus teaches us that true heroism sometimes lies not in individual excellence, but in the patient work of building institutions that outlast any single leader. His adventures on the road to Athens show us that strength used to protect the weak creates lasting benefits, while his work as king demonstrates that the most difficult battles are often fought not against monsters, but against the human tendency toward tyranny and corruption. In our own time, when democratic institutions face challenges from both external threats and internal division, we can remember the hero who showed us that freedom is not a destination but a process, not a gift but a responsibility that each generation must accept anew. The thread that guided him through the labyrinth becomes a symbol of the connections between citizens that make democracy possible, fragile, requiring constant attention, but capable of leading us safely through even the darkest passages if we maintain our trust in one another. Let your mind drift now to the bronze towers of Argos, where a different kind of heroic tale begins, not with impossible labors or long journeys, but with the tender vulnerability of a mother's love and the mysterious ways that fate weaves mortal and divine destinies together. Perseus, the great-grandfather of Heracles, represents heroism blessed by divine favor, showing us that sometimes the gods themselves intervene to ensure that courage is rewarded and innocence protected. Princess Danae was the most beautiful woman in Argos, daughter of King Achilles, who had received a prophecy that filled his heart with terror. The oracle had foretold that his daughter's son would one day kill him, a fate that seemed inescapable once spoken by the god's own voice. In his fear, the king made a decision that would echo through legend. 2012. He imprisoned his daughter in a bronze tower, guarded day and night, where no mortal man could reach her. But mortal precautions cannot thwart divine will. Zeus, king of the gods, had seen Danae's beauty and been moved not just by her physical perfection, but by her gentle spirit, her patience in suffering, her refusal to let imprisonment embitter her heart. He came to her as a shower of golden rain, pouring through the bronze walls as easily as sunlight through leaves. And in that miraculous union, Perseus was conceived. Picture the infant Perseus in his mother's arms, born in the darkness of the bronze tower but surrounded by a light that seemed to emanate from his very being. Even as a baby, he displayed the calm courage that would define his heroic career, never crying in fear but gazing at the world with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the gods themselves. Danae sang to him of the world beyond their prison, of heroes and adventures, of the great deeds that awaited those brave enough to attempt them. When King Achilles discovered that his daughter had somehow borne a child despite her imprisonment, his first instinct was to kill both mother and infant. But something, perhaps divine intervention, perhaps simple human decency, stayed his hand. Instead, he chose a more subtle form of execution, sealing Danae and Perseus in a wooden chest and casting them into the wine-dark sea, trusting the waves to accomplish what he could not bring himself to do directly. For days and nights the chest drifted on the Mediterranean swells, while Danae sang lullabies to keep her infant son calm and prayed to any god who might listen for deliverance. The sea, which had destroyed so many heroes and claimed so many lives, became their protector, carrying them gently toward a distant shore where destiny awaited. It was as if the ocean itself recognized that this child was marked for greatness and must be preserved for the trials ahead. The chest finally washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where it was discovered by Dictys, a kind fisherman whose nets had never brought him so precious a catch. When he broke open the chest and found the beautiful woman and her infant son still alive after their ordeal, he knew that the gods had sent them to his care. He brought them to his simple home and raised Perseus as his own son, teaching him the skills of seamanship and the values of honest labor. Under Dictys's gentle guidance, Perseus grew into a young man who combined divine heritage with human virtues. He learned to fish in the dangerous waters around Seriphos, to read the signs of weather in cloud and wave, to navigate by the stars that his divine father had placed in the heavens. But more importantly, he learned compassion from watching Dictys care for strangers, courage from seeing his foster father face storms at sea, and justice from the fisherman's fair dealings with everyone he met. The island's ruler was King Polydectes, brother to the generous Dictys, but possessing none of his kindness or wisdom. As Perseus grew to manhood and his beauty rivaled that of his mother, the king began to plot ways to remove this potential rival while claiming Danae for himself. The young hero sensed the danger and positioned himself as his mother's protector, but he also understood that direct confrontation would only lead to civil war on an island too small to survive such conflict. King Polydectes was too clever to challenge Perseus directly, instead devising a plan that would remove the young hero while appearing to honor him. He announced his intention to marry Hippodamia and demanded wedding gifts from all his subjects. When Perseus, who had no wealth to offer, boasted that he could bring the king any gift he desired, Polydectes smiled and made his request: the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned living beings to stone. It seemed like a perfect trap. The task was impossible, ensuring Perseus's death, while the young man's own words bound him to attempt it. But Polydectes had not reckoned with the divine blood that flowed in Perseus's veins, or the fact that the gods themselves had an interest in seeing justice done. As the hero prepared for his seemingly suicidal quest, help came from the most unlikely sources. Athena appeared to Perseus in a dream, her gray eyes bright with approval for his courage and indignation at Polydectes' treachery. She offered him her polished bronze shield, explaining that he could use its mirror-bright surface to view Medusa indirectly, avoiding the direct gaze that would turn him to stone. More than just a weapon, the shield represented divine wisdom, the understanding that some battles cannot be won through direct confrontation but require subtle strategy. Hermes, the messenger god, provided winged sandals that would carry Perseus swiftly through the air, a sword that could cut through the Gorgon's bronze scales, and most importantly, the guidance needed to find the three objects essential to his quest. The god's assistance came not just as equipment but as knowledge, the locations of those who could help him, the weaknesses of his enemies, the proper timing for his attack. Before he could face Medusa, Perseus had to obtain 3 magical items from beings almost as dangerous as the Gorgon herself. The Graiae, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, knew the location of the items he needed, but were notorious for their refusal to help heroes. They dwelt at the edge of night, in a realm where twilight never ended and shadows held more substance than light. Perseus approached their dwelling not with violence, but with cunning worthy of Odysseus himself. He waited until the moment when they passed their shared eye from one to another, then snatched it away, holding their sight hostage until they agreed to help him. It was a theft, but not a cruel one. He returned their eye once they had given him the information he sought, showing that even in trickery, a true hero maintains honor. The sisters directed him to the nymphs who guarded 3 treasures: a cap of invisibility woven from shadows themselves, a bag that could hold anything regardless of how dangerous, and knowledge of the Gorgon's location. Each gift came with its own test. The cap required him to face his fears of being forgotten. The bag demanded that he accept responsibility for containing great evil, and the location came only when he proved his motives were pure. Armed with divine weapons and magical aids, Perseus flew across the Mediterranean toward the Gorgons' island, a place where no living thing could survive, and even the rocks had been transformed to unnatural shapes by Medusa's deadly gaze. The very air seemed petrified, heavy with the weight of countless victims who had made the mistake of looking upon the monster's face. He found the 3 sisters sleeping in a grove where even the trees had been turned to stone, their branches reaching toward a sun they could no longer feel. Stheno and Euryale, the immortal Gorgons, lay beside their mortal sister Medusa, all 3 equally terrible in their twisted beauty. Their hair writhed with living serpents, their hands bore bronze claws, and their eyes held the power to end life with a glance. Using Athena's shield as a mirror, Perseus approached Medusa with the careful precision of a surgeon. He could see her reflection clearly. Once she had been beautiful, transformed into a monster, not through any evil of her own, but as punishment for another's crime. In her sleeping face, he glimpsed the tragedy of innocence, corrupted, beauty made terrible, love transformed into a curse that isolated its victim from all human contact. When Perseus's sword severed Medusa's head, he felt no triumph, only sadness for a life that had known nothing but loneliness and fear. From her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden warrior, her children by Poseidon conceived before her transformation. Even in death, Medusa gave birth to wonder and beauty, suggesting that the gods' punishments sometimes contain their own seeds of redemption. Carefully placing the head in his magical bag, Perseus flew away from the island as Medusa's immortal sisters awakened to find their beloved sibling dead. Their grief shook the earth and raised great waves on the sea, but the cap of invisibility protected him from their vengeance. He had accomplished the impossible task, but he understood that true heroism lay not in the deed itself, but in how he would use the terrible power he now carried. Flying homeward across the African coast, Perseus witnessed a scene that called to everything noble in his nature. Chained to a rock by the sea was a young woman of extraordinary beauty, left as a sacrifice to appease a sea monster that had been ravaging the kingdom of Ethiopia. This was Andromeda, daughter of Queen Cassiopeia, paying the price for her mother's boastful claim that her beauty surpassed that of the sea nymphs. Perseus could have continued on his journey, his quest completed, and his duty to himself fulfilled. But the sight of innocence suffering for another's pride moved him to action, just as his foster father Dictys had once acted to save him and his mother from the sea. He descended to the rocks, where Andromeda waited for death, offering to save her in exchange for her hand in marriage. when the sea monster Cetus rose from the depths, its massive form dwarfing ships and casting shadows across the water, Perseus faced it not with Medusa's head, that would have been too easy, but with his sword and his own courage. He wanted to prove that he could be a hero without relying solely on divine gifts, that the man was as worthy as the magic he carried. The battle was fierce and long, Perseus using his winged sandals to stay airborne while striking at the creature's vulnerable spots with divine precision. Victory over the sea monster should have led to happiness, but Perseus discovered that heroic deeds could create political complications as well as solutions. Andromeda had already been promised in marriage to her uncle Phineus, who arrived with an army to reclaim his bride just as the wedding celebrations were beginning. Here was a conflict that could not be resolved through noble combat or heroic virtue. It was politics, pure and simple, with innocent lives hanging in the balance. Facing overwhelming numbers and knowing that conventional battle would lead to a massacre of innocents, Perseus finally used the Gorgon's head, revealing it to Phineus and his warriors. In an instant, the would-be kidnappers were transformed to stone, their aggressive poses preserved forever in marble that would serve as a warning to future would-be tyrants. It was justice, but Perseus felt the weight of having used such terrible power, understanding that some victories come at costs that haunt the victor forever. With Andromeda as his bride, Perseus flew back to Seriphos, only to discover that his quest had not been fast enough to save his mother from King Polydectes' attentions. During his absence, the tyrant had forced Danae into marriage and was celebrating his victory with a great feast, surrounded by all those who had supported his conspiracy against the hero's family. Perseus entered the palace during the height of the celebration, still wearing his cap of invisibility, and witnessed the extent of the corruption that had taken hold during his absence. Polydectes was not merely a lustful king, but a tyrant who had used Perseus's quest to eliminate all opposition to his rule. The gentle fisherman Dictys had been imprisoned, Danae held under guard, and anyone who questioned the king's actions silenced through fear or death. Standing in the center of the feast hall, Perseus removed his cap and revealed himself to the assembled company. When Polydectes demanded proof that he had completed his impossible task, the hero obliged him, unveiling Medusa's head and transforming the entire corrupt court to stone in a single moment. It was justice swift and final, but Perseus felt no joy in it, only relief that his mother was free, and sadness that such drastic action had been necessary. With Polydectes dead and Dictys installed as the rightful king of Seriphos, Perseus faced the question of his own future. He returned Athena's shield, Hermes' sandals and sword, and the magical items to their divine owners, keeping only the memory of how it felt to fly above the earth and see the world from the perspective of the gods. The Gorgon's head he gave to Athena, who placed it on her aegis as a weapon against injustice. Longing to know his grandfather and homeland, Perseus traveled to Argos with Andromeda and Danae, hoping to heal the old wounds that had led to their exile. But Achilles, still haunted by the prophecy, fled the city rather than meet the grandson whose existence had tormented him for so many years. The old king's fear created the very situation it sought to avoid. Wandering as a refugee, he came to Larissa, where Perseus was competing in funeral games for the local king. During the discus competition, Perseus threw with the divine strength he had inherited from Zeus. The discus flew farther than any mortal athlete could achieve, striking an elderly spectator in the crowd and killing him instantly. Only when Perseus rushed to help the fallen man did he recognize his grandfather's features, understanding that the prophecy had finally fulfilled itself through accident rather than intention. Standing over Achilles' body, Perseus finally understood the futility of trying to escape divine will through violence or clever schemes. His grandfather's attempts to avoid the prophecy, imprisoning Danae, casting them into the sea, fleeing from Argos, had created the very circumstances that brought about his death. If he had simply accepted his fate and sought to make peace with his grandson, they might have found happiness together instead of tragedy. Perseus refused to rule Argos, feeling that the throne was tainted by the blood of its previous king, even though that blood was on his hands through divine will rather than personal choice. Instead, he founded the city of Mycenae, building it in a place where golden walls could catch the sunlight and remind him always of his divine father's gift. There he ruled wisely with Andromeda at his side, establishing laws based on justice rather than fear, and building institutions that would outlast any single ruler. The children of Perseus and Andromeda became the founders of great dynasties, their descendants including heroes like Heracles and kings like Eurystheus. But Perseus's true legacy lay not in his bloodline but in the example he set of how divine gifts should be used. Throughout his adventures, he had been tempted to abuse the power granted to him, but he consistently chose to use his abilities in service of justice and protection of the innocent. His story teaches us that divine favor is not a reward for perfection but a test of character. The gods granted him miraculous aid, not because he was flawless, but because they recognized in him the potential to use power wisely and compassionately. When faced with impossible tasks, he combined courage with intelligence. When granted terrible weapons, he used them only when absolutely necessary. When offered the chance for revenge, he chose justice instead. In his old age, Perseus looked back on his adventures with a mixture of pride and sadness, understanding that heroism was not about the glory of individual achievement, but about the responsibility that comes with exceptional gifts. He had slain monsters and saved innocents, but he had also learned that every victory carries its own burdens, and every power its own temptations. When death finally came to him, it was peacefully, in his own bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had inherited not just his divine blood, but his commitment to using strength in service of justice. Zeus honored his son by placing him among the stars as the constellation Perseus, where he would shine forever as a reminder that true heroism lies not in seeking glory, but in accepting the responsibilities that come with power. The story of Perseus completes our journey through the great heroes of Greek mythology, showing us that heroism takes many forms, but always requires the same essential elements: courage to face the impossible, wisdom to use power justly, and compassion to remember that strength exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In our own lives, when we face challenges that seem beyond our abilities, we can remember the heroes who showed us that divine favor comes not to those who seek it, but to those who prove themselves worthy through their choices and their character.